This week we will discuss pandemics. Pandemics historically was one of those key centripetal forces intermixing our fates. They were things that started in faraway places but had dire consequences for us. You may have come across the Spanish flu from the beginning of the 20th century, and I'm sure you have heard about the avian flu from the beginning of the 21st century. With Spanish flu, we know that it reached faraway places like remote Pacific islands, and by some accounts, it caused the death of 5% of humanity. Most recently, we have had movies like Contagion or World War Z, which dramatize the arrival of lethal viruses wreaking havoc from around the world. Throughout history, we have experimented with different ways to contain pandemics, and this week we have Professor Mark Harrison from University of Oxford going through them and explaining to us things like the plague and the cholera and what we have learned about the best way to deal with pandemics. His lecture and analysis is going to inform our larger quest of how we live in an increasingly interdependent world. Here's Professor Harrison.
Over the last few years, we have launched from one pandemic scare to the next, from SARS to swine flu, and most recently the emergence of a highly fatal new coronavirus. Pandemics are hardly out of the news. As a result, some commentators are beginning to talk about pandemic fatigue. Pandemics either fail to materialize, or when they do, turn out to be far less deadly than many imagined. There is a danger that the public is coming to mistrust public health authorities and the scientists who serve them. And yet the risk of a pandemic is real enough. A cataclysmic event on the scale of the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 19, where at least 50 million people died worldwide, may not be inevitable, but population growth, climate change, and changing relations between humans and animals are making such an event more likely. So too, of course, is the growing frequency of long-distance travel and trade. Indeed, according to some experts, we are now living in an age of pandemics, a period of increasing uncertainty in which humanity is increasingly imperiled by its own actions. Pandemics, especially of influenza, pose an imminent risk not only to our health, but to our prosperity. SARS caused losses of around $40 million, despite affecting relatively few countries and causing fewer than 9,000 cases worldwide. A bigger pandemic would bring the global economy to a halt. So, how prepared is the world to meet such an eventuality? Moreover, can a major pandemic be prevented? The view of most experts, including the distinguished epidemiologist Larry Brilliant, is that we are in a far better position to deal with a pandemic than in 1918. The World Health Organization's member states have agreed on regulations that require the notification of potentially pandemic diseases. Surveillance has improved and is improving all the time. In most countries, there are now clear emergency procedures in place to limit the spread of the disease and to keep essential services going. But are we doing anywhere near enough? As Brilliant and others have argued, there are many ways in which the surveillance of cases can be improved. The capacity of health services to deal with extra demands for vaccines, beds, and antiviral drugs also needs to be enhanced. These are all necessary measures, but can we really rely on surveillance and containment to check the spread of a disease as highly contagious as influenza? Surely no quarantine can be that effective. Nor am I optimistic that the nations of the world can pull together to the extent that they need to, especially when it comes to limiting the inevitable economic damage that a pandemic will create. But my biggest concern is that the current focus on the containment of infectious diseases is detracting from other equally necessary measures. We need to address the root causes of potentially pandemic diseases, as well as taking care to prevent their spread. In my view, the two things which urgently need to be addressed are, first, farming standards. Intensive farming is widely acknowledged to be one of the drivers of disease mutation and drug resistance through the overuse of antibiotics. Second, the tendency of many countries to use pandemics for national advantage. Both problems can only be addressed effectively if global regulations are tightened and if key agencies work together. As it stands, global health masks national interests. In a sense, we have been here before. Our own era of globalization was preceded by several earlier waves of integration, creating in the middle to the late 19th century the first truly global economy. Like today, the increasing frequency of global trade, labour migration and environmental change led to a surge in pandemics. Familiar diseases like plague and yellow fever re-emerged. New ones like cholera changed from being local problems to worldwide pandemics. Animal and plant diseases also circulated the globe, devastating agriculture and bringing famine in their wake. This was the first age of pandemics, even if the term pandemic wasn't widely used until the end of the 19th century. Although most of the diseases which then menaced the world were very different from those today, we can learn much from the history of these times. After decades of chaos, aggravated by national rivalry, the major nations of the world came together effectively to combat disease. They did so by relying not only on disease containment, but by addressing the root causes of the problem. In many respects, the disease which came to define the 19th century was cholera. It moved easily along the sinews of the new global economy, and it thrived in the conditions created by industrialization and the commercialization of agriculture. Cholera was often found in the filthy streets of crowded cities and in the insanitary conditions of plantations. Its rapid progress, aided by railways and steamships, caused enormous alarm, as did its high fatality rate and distressing symptoms such as profuse diarrhea. Until 1817, cholera was a local disease confined to the Ganges Delta, but in that year it became epidemic, most likely because the growth of labour migration in the vicinity of Bengal. Cholera soon spread throughout India, largely with the movement of troops, and in a few years it had spread throughout Asia, appearing as far west as Iran and as far east as Japan. By 1831, cholera had spread to Western Europe, and within a few years it had crossed the Atlantic. This was to be the first of several pandemics, which demonstrated the perils of global connectedness, and which highlighted the social costs of economic development. When cholera first appeared in the West, it was greeted with horror as a terrifying alien disease. The immediate response was to rely on measures like quarantine, which had been devised to control plague in earlier times. But these did not work, and cholera marched on, yet it did so meanderingly, showing a preference for the poorest and filthiest localities. It did not seem to be a straightforwardly contagious disease. In 1851, the European nations met in Paris to find a way to deal collectively with the problem of cholera and other epidemic diseases. There was no consensus. Some, like Britain, believed that sanitary reform was all that was needed. Others, like Russia, believed that quarantine and sanitary cordons were the only useful methods. These disputes continued through to the 1890s, with efforts focused on turning the Middle East into a kind of sanitary buffer zone. Rigorous quarantine of ships from India, the so-called home of cholera, was routinely imposed, despite the opposition of Britain, whose imperial connections were severed by the sanitary arrangements in the newly opened Suez Canal. Until the 1890s, Britain was isolated in its opposition to quarantine to control cholera. One result of this was that there were frequent disputes with other countries, sometimes leading to retaliatory measures which impeded navigation and trade. In Central Asia, both Britain and Russia used cholera as a pretext for quarantines that hindered the other and staked out claims to disputed territory. Other countries did the same. Governments also used the threat of cholera to justify trade embargoes, which were really meant to keep out cheaper foreign goods. In other words, a form of protectionism. By the early 1890s, there were signs that attitudes were changing. The germ causing cholera had been discovered in 1884, and there was strong evidence that it was spread in water. Some countries continued to insist on the need for rigorous quarantine, mostly for political reasons. But others were coming round to Britain's view that sanitary measures were the most effective means of controlling the disease. Blanket quarantine was not necessary, just the medical inspection of passengers on infected ships. Other countries were also coming to see that less heavy-handed measures were to their economic and political advantage too. Germany had recently acquired colonies in East Africa and pushed its allies towards supporting the British stance, seeking reductions in the quarantine at Suez. Only France stood outside the new consensus, which was built on science and the demands of the mature global economy. But this consensus broke down briefly, following the re-emergence of plague as a major pandemic disease. Long confined to pockets in the Middle East and China, plague broke out in the major commercial hub of Hong Kong in 1894. 2 years later, it had spread to the equally important port of Bombay. The response of the international community, led by France, was to impose rigorous quarantine against all ships from India and to demand drastic sanitary measures in British India itself. With trade out of India at a standstill, the British authorities attempted to meet international expectations. Draconian sanitary measures were introduced, including bans on movement, enforced hospitalisation, destruction of property, and the segregation of suspected contacts in camps, regardless of caste or religion. The result was a violent backlash against British rule, mass strikes and population flight from the major cities. This served to make a bad economic situation worse and shook the confidence of the British authorities, who feared a major uprising on the scale of the rebellion of 1857. After plague spread to other countries in 1899, it became clear that the disease was likely to strike anywhere. In Oporto, Sydney and San Francisco, business came to a halt. This was not so much because of the predations of plague, but the harsh measures imposed by national authorities and by other countries. It was soon evident that the disruption caused by plague could affect any nation, and that it threatened the stability of the global economy. Most governments began to use less disruptive measures, cooperating more with the public and relying less on quarantine. Increasingly, they sought to improve the poor sanitary conditions which existed in many port cities, and then turned their attention to rats, which was shown to be somehow related to the spread of the disease. Far less reliance was placed on quarantine or embargoes. These methods were less disruptive, and they also seemed to work. The plague pandemic reminded the major powers that their interests were to some extent interdependent. Imperial rivalry continued to escalate, but all benefited most from trade. Most major states and empires had been badly affected by the disruption caused by plague and the panic-driven measures which had been implemented in the past. At conferences in Washington in 1902 and Paris in 1903, European and American nations worked out a new consensus on how to meet the common threat of pandemic disease. This consensus rested on better sanitary measures in ports and on ships. It was resolved, too, to improve disease surveillance so that measures could be targeted more effectively, reducing the need for disruption of trade. The first international health organizations, the Pan American Health Organization and the Office International de Hygiène Publique, were established to collect this information. Subsequent conferences improved the system, which worked far better than the previous regime, in which disease had often been used as a pretext for protectionist quarantines and damage to rival states. Moreover, plague, cholera and diseases such as those no longer posed a threat to the global economy. After 1892, there were no major outbreaks of cholera in the West, and after 1921, there were very few serious outbreaks of plague, even in India, where millions had died in the 1890s and early 1900s. So what lessons can we learn from the history of disease and public health in the 19th century? Well, the first is that panic-driven measures did not work. The second is that quarantine and other methods of containment were unable to bring disease under control by themselves. The third was that attempts to pool health sovereignty and epidemiological intelligence helped to reduce epidemics, as well as disruption to commerce. So, where do we stand today? In some respects, the world is better equipped to deal with a pandemic, of whatever kind, than it was before. More effective surveillance means that we can now identify the emergence of new diseases at an early stage and target measures to contain them. This seems to have worked in the case of SARS and in some recent outbreaks of avian influenza. Yet better surveillance has not reduced disruption to the international economy. Too often, pandemics, or the threat of pandemics, are used to justify commercial protectionism. Appeals to scientific objectivity have been unable to resolve the disputes which inevitably result from this. Indeed, in some respects, the world is in a position not unlike the early years of the plague, before a new consensus on regulation was reached. Today, the ways in which states deal with pandemic disease are governed by the World Health Organization's international health regulations, which were revised in 2005 in the wake of the SARS pandemic of 2003. The World Health Organization also issues scientific guidelines about the nature of diseases, which it declares to be pandemics. The control of trade-related diseases are governed by the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement of 1995, which is enforced by the World Trade Organization. All these measures are designed to frame a common response and to prevent sanitary measures from being abused for protectionist and other purely national purposes. Unfortunately, these regulations have often proved inadequate to the task. States have often gone their own way in responding to pandemic disease. It is not so much that they have neglected their duties, but they have often implemented harsher measures than are justified by scientific advice. Matters of science, like those of law, are notoriously subject to interpretation. Existing regulations, like the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, contain loopholes which can easily be exploited for the purposes of protection. Ironically, the very notion of the pandemic is part of the problem. The label carries a lot of political baggage and automatically engenders media interest and public anxiety, initially at least. But there is no agreed definition of what a pandemic is. Is it merely a widely distributed infectious disease, or one with the potential to cause mass mortality? Moreover, states and other vested interests can make use of public concern to justify measures which exceed international regulations or guidelines. The climate of fear surrounding pandemics has been exacerbated in recent years by other concerns. The fear of terrorism is perhaps the most obvious, especially bioterrorism. But anxiety over pandemics is also closely linked to other aspects of globalization, for example trade and migration, also climate change and environmental degradation. These are all legitimate concerns, but they require very different responses. The problem is that the control of pandemic disease has become entangled with other security-related concerns. This dates back to the late 1980s and recognition of the potential of HIV/AIDS to destabilize Western and principally American interests overseas. By the time SARS appeared in 2003, the linkage between disease and national security concerns was well established, especially as regards terrorism. However, some commentators have argued that public health should be brought even more closely within the remit of national defence and security, that it should be securitized, to use the jargon. One of the principal exponents of this view is Andrew Price Smith, who in his book Contagion and Chaos argues that public health should remain predominantly a national interest. Like other exponents of the so-called realist or Republican realist position, he is sceptical of the claims of supranational bodies like the World Health Organization in matters of health, and is critical of their role in the past. This statement is wrong on several levels. Firstly, other security concerns have to some extent been entangled with those related to health. Secondly, what Price-Smith refers to as the Galenic tendency in public health, which is a very rather odd term for the environmental or sanitary perspective, has only rarely been opposed to what he terms the contagionist perspective, which he favours. Most states have seen the need for both, and that was certainly part of the international agreements that were formed in the early part of the 20th century. Public health has always been related to the defence of the realm, but it is equally about the common good. Both principles were evident in the emergence of public health during the Renaissance and have been ever since. For the most part, they have been mutually reinforcing rather than antagonistic tendencies. Today, the common good must be understood globally, for the risks we face are truly global ones. Security needs to be understood in the same way. The risks posed by pandemic disease must not be allowed to divide us, as they have so clearly in the response to some recent pandemics. A regrettable instance of this occurred in the so-called swine flu pandemic of 2009, or H1N1 to give it its proper name. After the pandemic was declared, several states, including Russia, China and Japan, imposed embargoes on American pork, despite the World Health Organization's insistence that such products were safe. The Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement contains clauses which permit extraordinary actions if they can be justified by science. And it was on this basis the bans were imposed. North American countries protested that these measures amounted to protectionism and prevailed upon several countries to rescind the measures. In the case of China, they were less successful, for this was merely the most recent installment of a long-running sanitary-related trade dispute. Such measures acquire a spurious legitimacy from the doctrines of security theorists and the atmosphere of panic created by the declaration of pandemics. Indeed, states taking tough measures compose as responsible adherents of the new doctrine of germ governance, which gained currency in the wake of SARS and 9/11. According to this, states which failed to take public health seriously were equated with the so-called pariah states which sponsored terrorism. In view of these problems, we should perhaps be more circumspect in our use of the term pandemic, or at least recognise that it is an arbitrary label bearing no clear relationship to a disease's severity or potential for disruption. More importantly, however, the recent response to pandemic disease, or diseases with pandemic potential, such as H7N9 influenza, shows that we are obsessed with the containment of infection at the expense of its prevention. Media reports have little to say about the conditions in which these diseases emerge. But as the previous age of pandemics shows, it is necessary to address the root causes of disease and the conditions in which they thrive. The causes of most of the diseases which have the potential to cause a major pandemic today are different from those of the past, but they need urgently to be addressed. Unless we do, pandemic security is hardly worthy of the name. What is needed is a more balanced approach to the problems which threaten us all. In this, local, national and global agencies all have a role to play. The most urgent need is to address the problems of disease mutation and drug resistance in intensive farms, which are providing more and more of the world's food, particularly poultry and pig meat. Reduction of stocking densities, better hygiene, less resort to antibiotics are all important measures on which there is widespread agreement among top scientists and international agencies such as the World Health Organization. Secondly, there is a need for global action to ensure compliance with these regulations. Standards vary immensely, and in many countries there is strong resistance to further regulation, for example of antibiotics or stocking densities. The preoccupation with biosecurity detracts from these more fundamental problems. Thirdly, there is a need for better coordination between the bodies responsible for aspects of human and animal health. Our destinies are interlinked. The World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Organization for Animal Health are beginning to work together. But this kind of cooperation is still in its infancy. We should never forget that 80% of human infectious diseases are shared with other animals, and that all recent pandemic threats have emerged as a result of our changing relationship with them. Lastly, existing international agreements, such as the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, need to be tightened to prevent their abuse. The threshold for extraordinary measures needs to be higher, and the powers of the World Trade Organization to enforce regulations need to be greater. At present, the most powerful states can afford to ignore the SPS agreement and the international health regulations, as in the early 1900s the solutions to the problems of pandemic disease are both local and global. But at present there are enormous tensions which need to be resolved if we are to enjoy real health security and commercial prosperity. The most obvious of these lies in the fields of animal welfare. Efforts by some nation states and the European Union to improve animal welfare for health and humanitarian reasons are threatened by pressure from the World Trade Organization to remove barriers to meat products which do not meet their higher standards of animal welfare. This is an unfortunate and ultimately untenable situation. Without global regulations on animal welfare, the forces driving the emergence of pandemic disease will continue to grow unchecked. Indeed, this is probably the most urgent task facing the international community from the point of view of public health. To imagine that we can stem the flow of new infections with biosecurity measures alone is an illusion, and a very dangerous one at that.
So this is all very interesting. It seems like we have better procedures and better defenses against pandemics now than we had in the past. This is also the theme of one of your readings for this week. It's from the 2007 WHO report on global public health safety. Professor Harrison also makes a number of interesting points. The one that I found curious is about the way we raise animals. He argues that 80% of infections we have are also common to animals, and with this intensive techniques we use for raising animals, this is going to increase mutations and crossovers. Yet another thing to be careful about. He also argues that when it comes to public health, we err on the side of caution and overreaction, while, let's say, in the case of climate change, we err on the side of neglect. I wonder whether that is because in health issues, the risks are immediate, dire, highly visible, and in the case of climate change, the effects come after a long time lag. Professor Harrison warns us about a fourth issue, and that is how countries may be tempted to use public health concerns for their narrow, petty interests. He gives certain examples, and in other fields too, like nuclear proliferation, we'll see a similar theme. It seems like we need a way to distinguish between narrow interests masquerading as high-mindedness versus genuine attempts to improve global welfare. There is one issue that I thought Professor Harrison left out, and that is smallpox. Smallpox has existed for thousands of years, was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, yet it was eradicated in 1979. And we may soon see the eradication of polio. I think these are hugely significant events. We can't just be concerned about risks and problems all the time. If we don't find a way to acknowledge and to celebrate our accomplishments, the fruits of our joint efforts, we may not find the energy and the determination to take on the next wave of our problems. There is incidentally one other good news. people have argued recently that ours is not just getting more healthy, ours is not a world that is more prepared to deal with pandemics, it's also a world that is getting less violent. I realize this is a counterintuitive argument to make, but most recently Steven Pinker made this argument in Better Angels of Our Nature. He even problematized this widely accepted notion that 20th century was the most bloody century in human history. You will have excerpts from his book in your readings for this week. For your writing assignment, your question is the International Health Regulations 2005. I ask you to define what they are and to argue what they represent. You, as usual, have 500 to 1,000 words to make your case.